Hey there guys, my name is Tim Perevozchikov and I'm going to be doing the September-October Public Forum topic analysis for the Champions Briefs. Before I actually dive into my analysis, a little bit about myself. I competed for 4 years at the Hawken School in Cleveland, Ohio on the Public Forum debate team, and I'm currently a freshman at Johns Hopkins University. Before I dive into the specific topic, I'm really excited that the NSDA has chosen a topic, literature, that traditionally doesn't get discussed in debate. And while many of us were quite apprehensive when we found out that the topic would be sports related, I think that unlike the last time with the NBA dress code, this topic is going to be a debate of substance and meaningfulness. That being said, the resolution that we will be discussing today is resolved on balance, public subsidies for professional sports organizations benefit their local communities. So in my topic analysis today, I'm going to be focusing much more heavily on strategic considerations and frameworks rather than specific pieces of evidence and argumentation. If you need to find specific pieces of argumentation, I strongly suggest going and taking a look at the Champions Brief's September-October Public Forum brief. It has tons of unique and quality argumentation, and I think that the topic analyses in there will provide further insight on top of what I'm going to talk about today. First, before breaking down the actual topic, I think that looking at the big major tournaments that are going to be occurring in September-October will provide a useful reference point in how you should be constructing your cases and the type of arguments that are okay and not okay to run. So the 4 major tournaments in the months of September-October that come to mind are the Harker Tournament, the Christian Tournament, Yale's Tournament, and the Bronx Invitational. I think that all 4 have many similarities. Specifically, as you go later in the month with the Harker Tournament and the New York City Invitational with Bronx, you're going to have to be creating a diversity of arguments because your opponents will probably have heard most of the literature, especially if they're going each weekend to a new tournament. I think that at these 4 tournaments, some common trends you'll see is a lot of former debate alumni, a lot of debate coaches, and at Yale in particular, you'll see former parliamentary or current parliamentary debaters from the Yale debate team that are very familiar with debate, but may see it in a more traditional sense of public forum, meaning that you should be giving more big picture analysis and telling a more cohesive narrative. I think, that being said, if we look to the topic itself, the topicality is, for the first time in a long time, not too difficult to break down. I think that the grounds on each side are pretty clear. The use of the phrase on balance seems to suggest some sort of cost-benefit analysis that defaults into more traditional utilitarian impacts, those of economic well-being, those of social well-being, and health. I think that that's specifically where the negative has a distinct advantage, and I think that the affirmative is going to have to get creative with their frameworks in order to get around a lot of these traditional impacts. I think that beyond that, if we look to the wording of the resolution, we notice that it's phrased in the current tense, meaning that if we were to ask a local official today, should you give your professional sports organization a public subsidy, we're asking whether or not right now the answer to that question is yes or no. And I think the reason why that's very important is because if we look to stadium construction, specifically public subsidies for stadium construction, we see a very clear trend. Namely, that unlike the 1960s, when public subsidies were rarely given and stadiums were privately financed in more suburban areas where most of their clientele were from, local officials have now used public subsidies and stadium construction in urban rundown areas as centerpieces of urban renewal and redevelopment projects. I think that by framing this in the round, the affirmative allows themselves the opportunity to escape a lot of the negative empirics, because often the data set that the negative authors are using are from the 60s and 70s when stadiums were still being privately financed. I implore you to look further into that. There's a lot of interesting analysis on that front. I think that we have to be, again, also remember that the phrase local community is in the resolution, meaning that impacts have to tie back to local community. And something that doesn't always get done is a definition of local community. I think by defining it, you can very clearly discuss impacts that are affecting the people of the area, or, for example, the cultural similarity. A sports team, for example, could unite a local community. And I think that by defining it, you give the judge a very clear understanding of what the resolution is actually asking. So, jumping into frameworks on both sides, if we first look to the affirmative, there are a few strategies that you could take up. The first is by framing the round in such a way where you discuss the value of civic pride and happiness. So an argument you can make on that front in framework is something along the lines of the reason why we have a government in the first place is to secure our welfare and happiness. And if having a sports team satisfies happiness for many people and increases civic pride, then on balance you could say that's good. In fact, a lot of negative teams, when they're running impacts linked to economic well-being, ignore the reality that we are more than willing to trade economic well-being for happiness. That's why some people are happy to spend $250,000 on a luxury sports car, or in the case of sports, willing to pay $50 to go see the Cleveland Cavaliers play. I think that in our reality, the value of happiness shouldn't be understated, especially in the debate round. Another strategy and framework that the affirmative can run is one in which it claims that the government's primary duty is to protect the literal well-being of its citizenry, meaning that its job is to protect the health of the public. And the reason why that's advantageous is because often public subsidies are given in the form of sin taxes. And the reason, if you aren't familiar with what sin taxes are, they're taxes on things like cigarettes and alcohol purchases, which deter a lot of people from purchasing the products because often they're quite hefty. I think that by running this sort of argumentation in the round and coupling it with a framework that discusses why we care about lives first and foremost, you allow yourself the opportunity to make quite a persuasive rhetorical case to the judge. I think on the negative, you conversely have just as many possible framework scenarios. For example, you could run a framework that discusses why the government's proper role is to protect those individuals in society which need it most, and we need to be evaluating moral claims in the round. By doing so, you can link it to arguments about eminent domain and secondary displacement, and about how the government has essentially been abusing their right and kicking people out. Now, the way eminent domain works, in many cases, is that occupants of that land are told by the government that they have 90 days to move out and find it and relocate, and the government pays them just compensation. But the caveat is that the government determines what is and is not just, meaning that they often can skew it and target poor areas where there is no legal recourse, there is no legal avenue for these individuals to turn because they simply don't have the economic capital to do so. Another strategy you can adapt on the negative framework is specifically by running a generic cost-benefit analysis framework. After all, you have loads and loads of negative authors which are discussing how time and time again, empirically, stadiums have not been beneficial, but rather have caused an economic drain in the city, have taken away from local businesses, have overall not done good things. I think that this sort of framework is strong early, especially early in the month, if you can find a lot of empirical research, because often the affirmative won't be familiar with your literature, and you can run a lot of unique impacts. That being said, overall strategic considerations on the affirmative. I think that the best affirmative cases are going to be those at the beginning of the month that preempt negative offense by discussing the trend lines argument that I previously mentioned. And on top of that, coupling it with some combination of the following 4 or 5 arguments that I think are really beneficial. I think if you're going to be running a framework on happiness, then you should certainly be coupling that with a happiness argument or a civic pride argument. I think that some other arguments you should explore are sin taxes, as I've discussed, there's a very unique argument on minor leagues. The argument goes as follows. Minor league subsidies are still subsidies for professional sports organizations, but they don't suffer from a lot of the major league harms that the negative talks about. And an author I suggest that you check out is Nola Aga, who does a study on minor leagues and warrants out and impacts out specifically why minor league stadiums and public subsidies are beneficial. Another argument you can be running on the affirmative is obviously a generic econ argument. But in order to make sure that your opponents can't simply pull out a block file, I would suggest that you put little nuances in your argument. For example, you can run an argument about real estate value increasing rather than just, oh, there's higher GDP or more temporary employment. That sort of argumentation is especially important on the 2-month topic, where diversity of argumentation is going to become limited later in the month. I think on the negative, the most persuasive option for me is to run some combination of moral harms and utilitarian harms. And I think you can do this in 2 ways. First, obviously, by discussing the economic drains that public subsidies for stadiums are. I think that it's the cleanest way to the ballot for the negative and is very easy to explain and understand to the judge. I think the second way you should be running this an argument is on the moral harms of some combination of eminent domain, secondary displacement, democratic harms, as in often elected officials don't follow public will in constructing stadiums, and beyond that, the proper role of a government isn't necessarily to finance the Cleveland Cavaliers. I think that many people would agree with that statement, and it creates for an emotionally appealing case. But if you don't like that option, I strongly suggest that you think outside the box on the negative. Arguments about eminent domain and secondary displacement are going to be researched quite heavily. They're going to be blocked out quite heavily. And by running unique arguments, you allow yourself the opportunity in rebuttal to come up with fresher arguments to discuss. So, just some final thoughts. I think that overall, if the affirmative gets creative enough, it certainly has a chance at the ballot. In fact, I don't think that the ground skew is big enough, like the college topic, where it's going to be heavily dominated. However, I think early on in the month, the neg is going to have the advantage, and as you go throughout and find better and better blocks, the affirmative is going to have a foothold. Good luck, and I'm really excited to see some of you at Yale and Bronx.